More and more, we're hearing the term stagflation show up in economic commentary across the spectrum. And the term stagflation, well, I think most people associate it with the 1970s. It's a combination of economic misery produced by repeated, very deep recessions alongside actual genuine inflation. And so, as the US economy has shown more signs of actually weakening here, the term stagflation has shown up again more frequently. However, stagflation really is just a shift in the narrative as the US economy continues to transition. And we've been talking about this transition ever since last September and October. We said something has changed, and now the narrative is changing along with it. When people say stagflation, what they really mean is back a little while ago, it seemed the economy was red hot and inflationary. Now we see more evidence that the economy isn't actually red hot, but Jay Powell says it's still inflationary. So we have the stagnation and we're applying the inflation to it, but we're assuming that's the case. When in fact, the stagnation is going to become more and more dominant, and pretty soon the inflation kind of disappears. So as we see the economy continue to show signs of transitioning, it's not stagflationary or inflationary. That's just a narrative that focuses on central bankers. And central bankers remain as convinced as ever that we have an inflation problem. They have no confidence in either their abilities to handle it. That's why they keep talking about higher for longer. Or do they show much as far as understanding where this consumer price pressure is coming from when it's not that difficult to see? And we also have the markets doing us a little bit of a favor here with oil prices moving lower and gasoline, wholesale gasoline at its lowest price since early March. So Steve Van Meter, stagflation. I know you have some comments about stagflation, especially in light of recent data, including we want to talk about jobless claims, one of your favorite. That had a pretty bad week this week too. But where do you see this as far as stagflation?
You know what's interesting about stagflation, Jeff, when I look at the charts, because people do go back, as you said, to the 1970s. They see this big run up in inflation, and then that's the expectation now. So, well, we had a big run up in inflation. It pulled back, and guess what? It's going to go even higher than before. There's something interesting that happens if we move the data series out of the 1970s and you start getting the 1980s and current, where we're more into a global economy. You notice that there's periods of stagflation that oddly show up right in front of these gray bars that show up on the St. Louis Federal Reserve chart. And those gray bars, if you've never seen them before, they mean a recession's coming. And what's really interesting to me about this, Jeff, is because we just got, of course, the weekly unemployment claims, which were immediately covered up and said, look, oh, it just has everything to do with, New York. They were on holiday and bus drivers or some other people. The 231,000 initial claims is really nothing. It's going to drop right back to that rock solid 212 number that we pretty much get week after week. But notably, the continued claims, they actually ticked up too. So what I see is happening, why do we get recessions following stagflation? It's pretty simple. Employers are raising prices at a point where consumers can't afford them. And then there's this lagged effect that next thing you know, all of a sudden, that there's no demand, and that demand sends us right into recession and more people losing their jobs because, of course, employers have no sales. So that's kind of what I see happening here.
Yeah, and there's any number of statistics that have come out recently that have gone in that direction. We see the ISM reports, for example, suggesting no sales is worse than no sales. But it all comes back to that same fundamental problem where we look at consumer prices in a certain way because that's what economists and policymakers tell us to do. And we go back to the 1970s. That's the last period we had out of control inflation. And we kind of put the two together and we think the one should follow the other. And so there's this widespread expectation that we're kind of stuck in the 1970s, though people don't realize or really understand what happened in the 1970s. And inflation, genuine inflation, doesn't go in a straight line either. So when you see the big rises and falls in the 1970s, people think, well, we're going to go through the same thing here. We had a big rise in 2020 and 2021, and now it's been slowing down, but maybe it's stuck and going to go back in the other direction. It's just like the 1970s. But as you're saying, Steve, as you're pointing out here, you can see the same type of behavior in something that isn't inflationary, where consumer prices tend to get a little bit more aggressive at maybe the worst possible time, as you're saying, when consumers can no longer afford price increases. And that's what's really striking about some of the more recent statistics that we got, is that exactly what consumers are saying. They're saying we can't afford anything anymore. And not only can we not afford stuff, because we can't afford stuff, our employers are starting to talk in a different tone. They're starting to look at our monthly or our weekly Monday meetings and say, which one of you am I going to get rid of? People can tell that everyone has gotten to their breaking point, both consumers as well as businesses. The business owners, the employers are like, our costs are going up and we really can't pass along our costs to our consumers. We're going to have to take a serious look at our payrolls.
Jeff, that is a great point, because we talked about in your show recently here that, of course, insurance costs were rising. So people think, well, employers are just going to keep raising prices because, well, they can. Well, they don't really want to do that. They have to raise them, and that's the issue here. But what do we just see this week? The credit card delinquency rates on a 30, 60, 90-day rate going up. Well, if you're delinquent on your credit card, that means there's probably a good chance that when you go use it, it's probably not going to work. And that's a problem, because we know Americans love to use credit cards. I mean, you almost never go to a store and see people using cash anymore. It's credit or debit. And then you look over to China, and what's everybody really worried about? Well, China, trying to keep their economy going, is juicing their factory production and trying to dump deflation on the rest of the world. And everyone say, wait, no, we don't want these cheap products because this is bad news. But isn't that what we want? We wanted deflation. We wanted the prices to come down. The problem happens is we've shifted, Jeff, from an issue where we had not enough supply and too much demand. And we're now very quickly seeing in the data where we have too much supply and demand. Well, we can't even find it because it's going away so quickly.
Yeah, isn't that interesting how China is now dumping their cheaper products around the rest of the world? Everybody's been complaining about consumer prices, and all of a sudden China's like, hey, we got a solution for you. We'll give you stuff really cheap. And everybody said, we don't want that. No, we don't want your cheap goods. So what is it? Do they want inflation, or it's just, as you were saying, it really is the inverse of the supply shock, where now we have too much supply. And the reason we have too much supply is simply that everybody confused 2020 and 2021 for an actual recovery. Because for quite some period of time, the nominal stuff looked really good, but it was mostly just price changes. It was mostly the lingering after effects of those imbalances. And now we have to pay for it. And we have to literally pay for it in a number of ways, including the fact that consumers they've been pressured so much over the last couple of years, they have fallen further and further behind. And you can sympathize with their plight, right? While everybody says the economy's booming, you look at your finances and you're like, I keep getting further behind. And now I have to worry about my job. Of course, that's going to have a major negative impact on consumer psychology. And it's not just psychology. As you're pointing out, there's also hard limitations in terms of real economics. Credit is just one of them. We can see it any number of ways. And we're getting all of this information confirmed to us from everywhere. It's not just one source or another source. I do like how you pointed out jobless claims, because you're right. It was New York City schools were in recess because it couldn't possibly be any other reason. But then you look back in the jobless claims data, and there was no spike last year at the same time, or the year before, But it's not really, like I said, it's not just about the one data point or another. It's all of them, even jobless claims, even this payroll report. They're starting to look weaker and weaker. We just got the University of Michigan sentiment survey, which I talked about in yesterday's video. And that one just absolutely crashed. One of the biggest misses in its 46-year history. And the reason it was missed, yes, consumer price expectations went up. But more than that, consumers said, we're really afraid about unemployment. And that's the theme that continues to come up over and over again, which is not just about consumers and their wrecked fiscal situation. It's also about businesses and their wrecked fiscal situation. And when you're a business and you were planning for demand to be this, and it comes in like this, you end up, you don't have many other good options.
No, you don't, Jeff, because what's really I find interesting about the University of Michigan survey, it's more about the labor market than anything else. And yes, you can take charts and you can say, okay, these things are related to that, but they're all derivatives of the labor market, because when people are confident, Well, usually it means they're employed. And you can really do something interesting. You can take continuing unemployment claims, which did go up last week, which was interesting. So not only did we see initial claims rise, but we see people on unemployment not get a job. But what we saw in the University of Michigan report here was something interesting. And it all comes back to the labor market. It's a durable good new orders demand, at least based on the survey, dropped to a 1-year low. And we come back to these ISM and these Fed regional surveys, and this is exactly what you and I have been talking about. If demand goes down, and we see it in the surveys, consumers say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to be buying those things. Then what we see in the surveys is new orders go down. But then we look a little bit deeper and we say, wait a minute, all these manufacturers have a ton of employees right now because everyone believed, as you said, we entered a new normal following the pandemic, and there's so much pent up demand, even though we couldn't see the fact that we stuffed people's pockets with fiscal stimulus and took it away. But that aside, then we look at, of course, that continuing order book, the backlogs, and what do we see? 14 months or some just ridiculously long period, drawdown after drawdown after drawdown. And the question I keep wondering, Jeff, and maybe this is what the University of Michigan survey was starting to suggest now, as you mentioned, people going to work and say, hey, we're not seeing demand, who's going to leave, is maybe those backlogs are about to hit zero and there's not enough new orders to support the existing workforce. And that means people are going to hit the unemployment line. And even worse, all those who are on severance, well, their runway is going to come to an end too. And they're looking at the labor market and saying, I don't see anything. When that happens, spending tanks.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the context of stagflation. What you just said is, I think, an incredibly important point. Again, it goes back to interpretation. And yes, everything is about the labor market and income. But many people looked at that, the same thing that you did, and said, that's a strong, resilient economy. It has been under these contractionary forces in manufacturing. It has been hit by consumer price changes for now almost 2 years, really about 2 years now. And it has held up. We haven't had the massive layoffs. We haven't had the recession that everybody recognizes as a recession. So it's understandable why people would say that must be a really strong economy. It's taking all of these hits, and just chugging along like it did all the time. Like nothing was bothering it. And yet you flip that around and look at it the other way and say, well, yeah, it does seem to be chugging along, but it's actually only barely chugging along. And all of this stuff, yes, it's taking forever to come out, but it's been there the entire time. And what you might see as a strong and resilient economy is actually really getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And as we know, economics, real small e economics, doesn't progress in linear fashion. So as you see, you're walking across a frozen lake, and maybe you don't notice that the creaks and cracks in the ice that are right underneath your feet. You think, well, I'm now in the middle of the lake, so the ice in the lake must be strong and resilient, and then boom, you go right into the water. I think that's what most people have pictured in their mind. You people have been talking about recession for so long, and it hasn't happened. Therefore, this is a strong economy. So it's inflationary. And then all of a sudden we see some signs of weakness. That must be just stagflation on top of it. It can't possibly be a recession or something like that, because it would have happened before now if it was going to happen. There's a bunch of logical fallacies tied up into this.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. And we can look at the first quarter here, because arguably we continue to see a slowdown, but there was this kind of just burst of activity. And we can look at the credit card data, consumer spending. We say, well, they had to be close to maxed out. We noticed they're starting to enter delinquency, but where did all the spending come from? Because the savings rate crashed too now. And that's a big indicator. Okay, well, maybe we're seeing this demand from savings. Well, that's pretty much gone. And what happened? Buy now, pay later, those 4-pay loan schemes that you can get at the register. I don't know if you know, so you can go there and you can push a button and pay, hey, I'll pay over 4 payments. Well, because they're not reported to credit agencies, which is brilliant, you can be delinquent on your credit card, who won't give you any more credit for, well, obvious reasons, but you can still buy stuff. And the data this week came out and said, you're going to be shocked by this, that consumers were starting to get delinquent and miss their payment on those loans too. And so all of a sudden, everyone bought into this narrative because, as you said, hey, well, if it hasn't happened, it's not going to happen, because for some reason you have to put recessions on a clock. No different than what we saw from the Fed say today, and some of the Fed speakers say, well, inflation didn't come down over our timeline. Well, you didn't give us a timeline, so that's a really good scapegoat. And people spent, And now they're finding out the economy just didn't do what they wanted it to do.
Like you said, Steve, it all comes back to the labor market. The reason that consumers are behind on their credit cards, the reason consumers are behind on their their pay now loans or whatever they're called, they don't have enough. They don't have enough income. It really is that simple. And rather than that being corrected by a robust labor market that has all sorts of job opportunities for people to take advantage of, it's going in the opposite direction, which is why consumers keep telling these surveys they're afraid of their jobs. Not only do they have insufficient income to maintain their spending on discretionary items, they also have insufficient income to maintain their spending on non-discretionary items, which is why we see oil and gasoline demand weakening too. And there is no labor, there's no source of strength left. As you pointed out, savings are exhausted, transfers may be stopping or at least slowing down. Even the government jobs hiring boom looks like it might be coming to an end. So it's one avenue after another. One of these false artificial legs under supporting the economy keep getting knocked out one after another. No wonder consumers are becoming more pessimistic. They see the end of the line here, and it isn't the stagflationary one. Like you said, Steve, before every recession, you get the same thing. Consumer prices go up a little bit, but yet the ice is cracking beneath everyone's feet.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of pretty scary for the average consumer now. They bought into this narrative, they loaded up their debt, and you think like, is a 0.25% rate cut or a 0.5% rate cut, or maybe if we just stop doing quantitative tightening, that is really going to change the perspective for consumers? And the answer is no. And that's the problem here is the Fed keeps saying, well, we need to go a little bit longer. We're just not convinced yet. And even though they don't realize, maybe they do, that they're tying their projections to a very lagged data series, which is consumer prices, that consumers are just starting to hemorrhage. And you kind of predicted this. You said a few weeks ago, we were talking about energy prices. I don't know if you remember, Jeff, but you said, hey, gasoline prices kind of spiked here, and this isn't going to go well for consumers because they can't afford it. And the next thing you know, what do we see almost right after that? All of a sudden, slow down, slow down, slow down. You mentioned WTI being at 78. Well, that's certainly not inflationary. That's not showing you demand. That's telling us there's serious problems in the economy. And the Fed, that's okay. They're on hold.
I keep coming back to, Steve, just talking about interpretation. What would oil and energy prices be if it weren't for all of these supply restrictions? We wouldn't be talking about inflation at all. We'd be talking about, holy crap, this economy is really weak. Well, that's the thing. The economy is really weak. We just can't see it in the oil price, and then it filters into inflation. And everybody got this wrong idea. Again, it's understandable because it's taken a long time for the cycle to play out as much as it has, and you have all of these false signals that are. I think the point we're really making here about stagflation is these false signals are starting to fade one after another, and they're leaving us with this fundamental view of the economy, and it is not the one that everyone had pictured in their mind. It's more fragile and more weak, and it all comes back to, as you said, that's got to be the title here. It all comes back to the labor market. It's not stagflation; it's economic weakness because their employment is weak, and it's understandable why that's the case. Huge thank you to Steve and Metre for joining me again. If you want to see our discussion last week on breaking down the jobs report and all of the statistics related to employment, that's the video got linked below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and Eurodollar University subscribers. And until next time, take care.